Good morning, everybody. My name is Jonathan Fisher, and I am the host and moderator of today's program, along with my co-host, Robert W. Scott. The chief is with us. So today we've got a special guest, and our special guest is Alan Miller. And Alan is going to be talking to us about the Great Northern Cherry Valley Branch. Today is October 7th, 2025, and we're recording this program at 10 a.m. Pacific time. So at this point, Robert and I are going to mute and hide our screens, and we're going to turn the presentation over to Alan. Alan.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. My program today is on the little-known Great Northern Cherry Valley Branch, which uh, was very short-lived, lasted from 1911 to 1917, and it ran 18 miles from Monroe southbound to the town of Tolt, which is now the town of Carnation. So once upon a time, there was the village of Cherry Valley. And this area was established in the mid 1870s, homesteaded by Civil War veterans mostly. And it was rather remote. Transportation was mainly by river, either by canoe or they had paddle wheel river boats during favorable water levels. We see a paddle wheeler here towing a tow of logs down the Snoqualmie River. Logging was becoming the newest industry up there. Lots of good timber up on the lands. They built this swing bridge across the river here in 1906 so that they could get across the river reliably. Before that, there was a kind of a ferry. And you can see that they had to have this bridge because of the river boats to get up and down the river was necessary. There was also a crude dirt road from Falls City to Monroe, but it was almost impassable for in the winter months during the rainy season. So as early as 1902, there was talk of need for a railroad in the Snoqualmie Valley to Seattle. And in 1905, they formed the Snohomish Cherry Valley Railroad. And there was mostly talk, nothing got done. So it was nicknamed the Cherry Valley Hot Air Line. But it was reorganized in 1906 to the Snohomish Valley Railway Company. And this is a stock certificate from that railroad. You can see the bicycle tree here in Snohomish, and that it was going to be electrified. And so this was going to be the railroad line in there. But then the following year, articles of incorporation were filed on August 30th, 1907 by John T. McChesney, forming the Everett and Cherry Valley Traction Company to build an electrified rapid transit line from Monroe to Falls City. And McChesney was the president of the Everett Improvement Company and James J. Hill's ally in the West. And so it kind of points to that the Great Northern was in charge of this thing right from the beginning. In fact, all the Everett and Cherry Valley Traction Company holdings were sold to the Great Northern on June 21st, 1912. Here's a telegram from Lewis Hill, which was James Hill's son. He was president of the GN at that time. This last line is interesting. I see no reason why this should not be handled as a straight Great Northern job unless your people see some reason for further disguising our line. Because this line was sold as a farmers that it would be a rapid transit transportation in the valley. And they some of the farmers are so happy to hear that they sold their right away cheap or even for free. to get this railroad. And so there was quite a bit of disappointment when it turned out to be a branch of the Great Northern. This is Arthur Hicks's store at Cherry Valley, and as the Everett and Cherry Valley Traction Company was surveyed, it was the line was going to run right through the middle of the store. So it was going to have to be moved along with several other buildings that were in the way. And so here's the store up in the new town site on its lot. And another building that had to be moved was this church. This was the oldest building up there. This church was built in 1887 by Reverend McNamee, who wrote a book about his experiences. And here we see the church jacked up on blocks, getting ready to be moved. And to kind of give you an idea of the time it took to move these buildings, Hicks's store was they began moving it on the first week of November 1909, and it was placed on its lot up in the new town site in the third week of December. And this Methodist church was placed on its lot in mid-February. And around the same time, um, Bruce and Company started driving pilings down at Cherry Creek for a bridge that was going to be a mile and a quarter long. And then a steam shovel showed up here where the city or the village of Cherry Valley was to start excavating the hillside. This was the parsonage building, and they didn't have a regular minister. They just had a circuit rider that came through every now and again. So they used this building and rented it out to the school teachers. And we see a couple of the Cherry Valley school teachers sitting on the steps. When they jacked this building up to move it, the floor fell out of it. So they, the GN agreed to build a new parsonage, which is this building here, but behind the church. And here's the church on its lot in town. And here we see the village is now vacated. The only thing left is the lean-to that was on Arthur Hicks's store. And they lived in this lean-to during the moving of the store, but then the Great Northern uh, crews come in here and started blasting, and it got to be dangerous. So Mr. Hicks moved his family to a hotel in Monroe, and then he would probably slept in the store or something. And they had several suggestions for names for the new town, including Virginia and LaBird, but they settled on Cosgrove to honor a governor that had just recently passed away. But a few weeks later, they were informed that the post office couldn't use that name because another town named Murray, which is down by American Lake, had already changed their name to Cosgrove. So they settled on Duvall, which was in honor of a early pioneer and logger in the area, James Duvall. So the name of Duvall was officially adopted on the first week of September of 1910. And, and they had big plans for the city, or at least they made it look that way. You can see quite the metropolis here. Trains running on both railroads, riverboats, which the riverboats ended. The railroads took all their business, so uh, that was the end of them. The swing bridge, they have it where the present bridge is in Duval. The swing bridge really was further up here where the village of Cherry Valley sat. And there was concern with two railroads going through town because within 6 months, the Milwaukee Road was planning their branch line down the valley that parallel the Everett and Cherry Valley Traction Company. And so there was concern in town about uh, having to cross two railroads at grade. So the Great Northern and the Milwaukee jointly built this overhead crossing to get down to the swing bridge. This is where the village of Cherry Valley was. And up here, just off the screen, is where the new town of Duvall is. And this is a poor picture here, but this is the overhead bridge. And we're looking at the main line of the Milwaukee's branch and their passing track. And then the Great Northern came through right about in that bent right there. And here's a little better view of the overhead bridge. And then this is the trestle into the shingle mill. There's a shingle mill built on the river here that was going to be the main employment for town. And here's the mill. It started out as the L.T. Smith Shingle Mill, but it was bought out by the Townsite Company and became the Cherry Valley Shingle Company. Here's a label off of their shingle bundles. And here's a map showing the Milwaukee Road spur into the mill. This portion was a log dump here to dump logs that get caught in their boom. And this was a loading spur next to the dry kiln. But you can see the Great Northern had plans for a spur into the mill here too, but they got beat out by the Milwaukee. When the Milwaukee came down through the valley and surveyed it, they did a sneaky thing. They squeezed their railroad in between the Great Northern and the river. And so they got the choice uh, spots to put spurs in on all the mills and stuff that were located along the river. And here's I couldn't find a real map of the hmm, I used to be able to enlarge. I guess I'll do it with a wheel here. Um, so I had to make this up myself. So I drew the green in to represent the Great Northern's line, and the other one is the Milwaukee Roads. And so when you're going south from Monroe, the first station was Foy Spur, and this was just a temporary connection here because the Great Northern got their rails down about 6 months ahead of the Milwaukee Road. So the Milwaukee Road had their materials shipped in on the Great Northern, and this was one of the spots where they interchanged the material to help build the Milwaukee line faster. Kelly's Crossing was a gravel pit that both railroads used for ballast and fill material. Then you come to High Rock, and here the Great Northern crossed, or actually the Milwaukee crossed the Great Northern and put the railroads on opposite sides of each other. And so you had a grade crossing. Now, Highway 203 runs pretty much on the Great Northern grade all through this whole area here. And so when you cross the old Milwaukee grade on the highway there, that's where this grade crossing for the two railroads was. And then you had a big logging operation here. You can see some of their line up the Lake Fontel. This was a Stevensburg Lumber and Logging Company, otherwise known as the High Rock Logging Company. And so the Great Northern had two tracks in here. They had a Stevensburg Industry Spur and then the Stevensburg Logging Spur, which actually connected to the logging railroad so that they could interchange business. Next was Peter Serini Spur. He was a farmer and he had a little spur here. And then you had the CB Mill, Cunningham and Bergstrom's shingle mill on the river here, and both railroads served that. And then you had the Forks Logging Company. They had a logging line up here in the woods, and they come down on this grade here and did a half circle and came into a log dump on the river. And they didn't use any log cars. They actually skidded their logs between the rails and just uh, pulled them out with a 45-ton climax. Now we cross the county line into King County, and you have the station of Bacchus. There was a lumber mill here that shipped on both railroads. And then you had a big shingle mill here on Cherry Creek called O'Neill Gowan shingle mill. And so there was a spur into that. And then there was an O'Neill Gowan shingle bolt spur over Cherry Creek where they could just bring shingle bolts in on the rail cars and load them into the creek. And then you had Cherry Valley Logging Company's logging line came down to a log dump here on the river. So that was crossed at grade by both railroads. And then the town of Duvall formerly Cherry Valley, and then Novelty was a pretty old community in this valley, and it was just a small area with a store and a few farmers around the area here. But presently, this is where the roundabout is on Highway 203 south of Duvall. And then there was nothing else till you got down to Stillwater. You had Daymeyer's was another farm, but they didn't even have a spur track, just I think a milk platform was all that was there. And then here the railroads crossed again, but now you had a three-way crossing. You had the Everett and Cherry Valley Traction Company, you had the Milwaukee Road, and then you had the Stillwater Logging Company coming down to their log dump. And so it kind of formed a triangle between the three railroads there. And then nothing until you got down to the city of Tolt, which is now Carnation. And so this is the bridge over the Skycomish River coming out of Monroe. And it was a four-span Howe Truss Bridge. It was pretty much identical to the Milwaukee Road's bridge over the Skycomish River, except that the GN never covered this bridge. It was left open like this all the time. And it ran into difficulties as soon as they were building it. They had a massive flood on the river that piled up all this debris against the falsework and ended up taking out two of the spans. And so they were having problems before they even got constructed, but they did get it rebuilt, and so here's a view of it. Now we'll take a look at the industries as we're going down. This is High Rock that I talked about earlier. Stevens Bird Logging Company came down off the hill here and originally swung around here down to ground level and then went to their log dump. Well, the railroads didn't want a grade crossing with this logging company, so they jointly built this big overhead bridge over the logging company. And then within a year, the logging company wanted to start shipping their logs by rail instead of floating them down the river. So the Milwaukee built this double tracked bridge here for an interchange to receive logs from the logging company there. Here's where the grade crossing was. This would be Highway 203 now, where the GN was. And this was the Great Northern's Stevens Bird Industry Spur. And then this was their connection to the logging company. And here's a picture of it. Here's the overhead bridge, and you got a Shea locomotive down here with 7 loads of logs. And then there's 7 loads of logs on the Milwaukee interchange. So it looks to me like 7 loads was their limit coming down their grade. And then this track was for empties. And you can see everything's new ballast everywhere. And here's the Great Northern's line with their industry spur. And then the logging line went down over the hill here and connected to the GN over here. And then underneath is the county road. And we got a mail wagon drawn by a horse here, U.S. Mail RFD number 1, it says on it. This is a view from the overhead bridge looking north towards Monroe. And on the left here, you have the Milwaukee Road Stillwater Logger. And got the guys up on the caboose. It must be the conductor here and a couple of brakemen sitting up here. But you got a guy standing on the log car here, and you got a guy leaning against the log car over here. And then if you zoom in on this, you'll see that the whole engine crew is up on the cab. So this train is definitely posed for a photographer here. And then in March 1913, the Great Northern expanded their storage tracks here at High Rock so that they could start receiving loads too. So here we see 4 cars of logs And Stevens Bird owned the Cascade Mill in Snohomish, so that's where these logs here are going to be destined for. I don't know where their logs to the Milwaukee went to because the Milwaukee didn't have a connection to their mill at Snohomish, but they may have had another mill somewhere. And this farm over here is Elmer Stevens' farm, and he was, the part of Stevens and Bird. And he sold this farm to the state, and that became the Monroe Corrections Center Honor Farm. And this is just a map I cobbled together to show an all-time uh, showing of all the tracks that were at High Rock at various times. The red is what was left when they pulled up the Milwaukee line. There was basically just a 10-car spur here at High Rock, and that was all that was left. But it was a very busy place at one time up until about the mid 1920s. This is the Peter Serini spur, and this was after the Great Northern had been abandoned. So there, the spur was taken up, but the Milwaukee put in a replacement spur here for them because the Great Northern still had this business in the valley. It's just that it got moved over to the Milwaukee. And this is the CB shingle mill. And this is kind of interesting because you the red is the Great Northern, and they put a spur into the mill, and this portion of the spur was on trestle work. And then along comes the Milwaukee, and of course, they cross their spur at grade on their own little bridge, and then they stuck in a spur and squeezed it in alongside the Great Northerns. In fact, it was so tight that the shingle company had to cut 9 feet off of their dry kiln to make room for a loading dock. But this was uh, a go-getter mill. They received their shingle bolts by a flume that come down from the hills above and then would dump the bolts in the water, and then they had a boom here to catch them. And this mill was pretty busy, but it caught fire and burned down in 1914. So they rebuilt the mill on the Everett waterfront and went from there. They were still going clear into the 1950s in Everett. And I was told by one of the historians at Everett that CB uh, Shingle Company developed some kind of a shingle or a method of putting down shingles that became a standard in the industry. And then I had a letterhead from the company, so I just stuck that on there for fun. Okay, this is the Forks Logging Company. Like I said, they just drug their logs. They would cable them all together, and then this 45-ton climax would drag them down out of the woods. They had an 8% grade coming down to this landing here, and they did have a couple of runaways with their log trains because if the ties were frosty, you don't. There's no way of hand braking logs. Once they get going, they come up against the locomotive, and nothing you can do. But anyway, they would pull the logs down here to the landing, and then they'd run around them and unhook all the cables and stuff, and then they would shove on these logs, and they had a set of shear skids that would kick them off into the river. And here's a map showing their line coming down, and then their log dump right here. And this is a Google Earth shot of the same spot. This is now known as the Cherry Valley Road, but you can see where their half circle was here in this field, and then they came along the river here. And this is a panoramic view, but because they drug their logs between the rails, there wasn't any way for them to have a grade crossing with these two mainline roads. So they built an overhead bridge here for them, as well as what they did for High Rock Logging Company. But this was kind of a wasted effort. They built this overhead bridge in 1911, and by the following year, High Rock Logging Company bought them out and logged their holdings from from their end. So this trestle only served a year and it was obsolete. And this is a little further down. This is a um, area called Bacchus, which the name Bacchus still shows up on some maps to this day, even though there's been nothing there for a long time. But this was H. Bacchus was a contractor that helped build the Milwaukee Road, and he liked what he saw in the valley here, so he bought a stand of timber up here on the hill and built a sawmill and went into business here. And he put in a flooring machine, and so he cut a lot of flooring type lumber. I know of at least one load I saw that was billed to Shaston, Washington. And so the Great Northern put a spur in here to serve him, and then the Milwaukee also put a spur in. And then you had the O'Neill Gowan shingle mill on Cherry Creek here, and they built a spur into that, and both railroads connected to it. And they had a dam about 2 miles up Cherry Creek where they would cut shingle bolts, and they would fill this big pond full of shingle bolts, and then they would raise this dam, and they'd all come rushing down the creek and get caught in their boom here. But in 1912, Great Northern put a spur in on their bridge here over Cherry Creek so that shingle bolts could be brought in by rail car, and they just offload them into the creek here, and then they get caught in the mill's boom. And then this was the start of Great Northern's Bridge number 33, which was over 6,500 feet in length. And I think it was 407 bents. Um, and then here's your Cherry Valley Logging Company coming down to their log dump that crossed both roads. And then the Great Northern put a connection into them. This is the only picture I could find of O'Neill Gowan's shingle mill, and it's a pretty poor picture, but it came out of an Everett newspaper. But it was a pretty good sized mill for its day. The concept of it was O'Neill and Gowan were executives in the Cherry Valley Logging Company. And Cherry Valley was controlled by Weyerhaeuser. All their logs went to the Weyerhaeuser mill in Everett. And Cherry or Great or Weyerhaeuser didn't want cedar. They didn't have a use for cedar. So when they come to stands of cedar, they either skipped over them or they cut them and just left them to rot on the ground. And so these two guys got together and thought, well, let's build a shingle mill and then we can utilize that cedar. And so that was the concept of O'Neill Gowan's mill. This is a group photo of O'Neill Gowan employees, but you can tell these guys are shingle weavers because this guy's missing two fingers. Looks like this guy's missing two, and it looks like this guy's missing a couple. So uh, that was the life of a shingle weaver. That showed you had experience. You ever worked in the mill before? Hold your hand up and missing fingers. Yep. This is what's left of O'Neill Gowan today, just a big concrete block out in the middle of the field where their boiler room was. And under all those blackberries and dirt is a lot of brick from the boiler house. And then this was what I found left of their spur out to the mill. There was this one bent here of pilings that were all worn off. There might have been more bents back here in the blackberries, but I wasn't going to go bushwhacking to find them. And this is a panorama looking south. And here's where the Cherry Valley come down to their log dump. And here's where the Great Northern connected to them. And you can see the Great Northern's trestle starts out here and comes all the way back. And then the Milwaukee, like I said, squeezed themselves between the Great Northern and the river. Well, here it come back to bite them. The river was so close to the Great Northern that they had to swing their track right up against the Great Northern. And then this is the county road here. So things were rather tight there. And then, of course, after the GN was pulled up, people would look at a map of the Milwaukee and why, how come Milwaukee had this big bend in it right here? Well, that's why. And the town of Duvall is just around the corner. And this was the Valley House, which was a saloon and boarding house that was put up here for Cherry Valley Logging Company. But Great Northern connected to it, and there's a Great Northern switch stand right there, which would be out in the middle of a cornfield today. And this is the county road. And then here's a map of it. Cherry Valley, there's the Valley House and the county road right there. They didn't draw it far enough, but this line would go clear down to here and they had a log dump on the river. And here's the town of Duvall. And this is early 1911, and the Milwaukee is excavating their portion of the hillside north of town. And so they use these little dinky engines on narrow gauge rails with dump cars, and they're hauling fill out here to fill up where they're going to put their yard in. We can see the Great Northern's already up and running. They got cars on the siding here at Duval. This is their depot, and this is the town where the buildings were moved to. And this building down here was the Duval Hotel. It was located down close to the railroad tracks. And they got wood sidewalks and muddy streets. And here's the excavation work. The Great Northern line was in this cut over here, and they used that fill to go out into the valley a ways. But the Milwaukee, when they did their excavation, then they said, well, why can't we take out the rest of this fill between the two railroads? So they got permission to do that. So that's why the Milwaukee was able to put fill almost all the way out to Cherry Creek, where the Great Northern had to maintain this huge trestle. And here's the railroad coming into Duval, and here's that long trestle. Well, the GN surveyed this alternate route here. I think they thought if they did this, they wouldn't have to maintain this. But the maintenance of this outweighed the maintenance of that, I guess. It looks like they bought two parcels of right of way here. And I'm guessing they did that so that if they did decide to go this route, they could use those parcels for eminent domain to get the rest of their right of way. And there's the town of Duval there. And then here's your Cherry Valley Logging Company coming down to their log dump. And this is the Duval Depot, and this is opening day. This is May 15th, 1911, the first train. And the trains were just mixed trains, which made the residents even more mad because it wasn't rapid transit. It was, I think the train time took like 45 minutes to get from Duval to Monroe, which is only 9 miles, but they had to stop and switch all the mills along the way, so it was a slow ride. But this is local resident Joe Doherty on the wagon here. And then this is George Irwin, the fireman. He was a fixture on that line for the whole time it was in operation. And here's a view of the depot from a newspaper picture, but it was a um, pretty good sized depot. It was 24 feet by 118 feet long. And I'm assuming they had separate men's and women's waiting rooms with a ticket office in the middle. And then the freight room was divided apparently into maybe half of it was express and half was freight. But it was an ambitious building for a small town. Here's another view of it with the train spotted in front. And the engine 298 was a fixture on this line. I'll get more into the history of that engine later. And then here's the train going the other way. And I like this guy that set up an observation car on the rear there with his chair. And it had a standard Great Northern Swift style train order signal on the building, although I doubt they copied many train orders. It was seldom that there was more than just the one train on the line. And then here's the depot with the milk shipment. And the sign did get saved. Uh, when I realized that there was a Great Northern Depot in town, suddenly a light went on, and I thought, there's a sign on the building outside of town. And I wonder if that building is the old depot. So I went and inquired to a guy, and he said, no, that's not the depot. But he said, you're right, that is a sign. Somebody saved one of the signs off the depot and hung it up on that building. He says, why are you interested in it? I told him I was a railroad historian. He says, well, if you want that sign, you better get it now because next weekend they're coming in and they're burning that building because they were gonna put a boat launch in down on the river. So I was only about 4 days from saving that sign from being burned up. This is from the overhead crossing, looking at the town of Duvall. Here's your Great Northern Depot here. The shingle mill, Milwaukee Depot is back here. And the town has grown considerably now. And this is only 1912, so it's only a couple of years since the town was founded. And all the Great Northern had for side tracks in Duval was this 1,700-foot passing track here. They were going to put this spur into the shingle mill, but it got kiboshed by the Milwaukee. So they had no side tracks or spurs or anything there to take care of. This was the GN depot here and then the Milwaukee depot here. So you can see they were almost across from each other. And then these are cottages here for the section foreman and the GN section crew lived in this bunkhouse here. And this was another mill that was planned. It was called the Duvall Lumber Company, was their technical name, but all the locals just dubbed it the Big Mill. But it was going to be a, a lumber mill, a shingle mill, a lath mill, and a blacksmith shop. And they started work on it, and the Milwaukee Road built a spur track into it with a log dump. And then you can see where the Great Northern had plans to put a spur in to connect up to it. And this was supposed to supply a lot of jobs and business and revenue for the town. But every time it was going to get uh, ready to start up again, something would come, the price of lumber would drop or whatever. They even changed the county roads. This lighter brown is the old county road, and they had to relocate the county road over here. And anyway, the mill eventually failed um, to open up, and a lot of um, old timers in the valley speculated that this mill was never intended to operate, that it was basically just bait to get people to come to the town and buy lots. And once they sold enough lots, they kiboshed the idea of the mill. This is the only picture I have ever been able to find of the big mill. It just shows a little portion of it on the river. This is the Milwaukee Road Depot at Duvall, which still exists. It's up in Depot Park as a community center nowadays. And this is a panorama of the town taken down by the river. Here's your cottage for the Great Northern section foreman, and then the section men lived in this bunkhouse here. And Duval livery, and you can see the steeple for the Methodist church that was moved from Cherry Valley. And then the Forest Inn here was the pride of the town. It was a big two-story hotel here that was quite elaborate and built in a rustic style. Here's a Great Northern train south of Duval. In fact, I think this is my great-grandfather's property here and his underpass that the train is on. They're bald-faced in a flat car in front, but I wonder what this car is. it looks like a low box car. It must be a non-revenue. It's number X525, but I have no idea what that car would be used for. But this is a thoroughly freight train, no passenger cars on it. And then you got a caboose there. And then this is just a crop of the same picture showing the 298 locomotive that was, like I say, a fixture on the line. This is grading operations at Novelty for the Great Northern. This is where the present roundabout would be on Highway 203 today. This is the Novelty store, and he also sold farm implements. So he had a spur here on the Great Northern that he would get shipments of stuff in. You can see here a bunch of milk cans in the wagon. These are probably going to the condensery at Monroe for Carnation Farms. So this is the Great Northern's tracks here, which is now Highway 203. And then this is the Milwaukee's line over here, which is now the Snoqualmie Valley Rail Trail. And this is the Great Northern Pasture Shelter at Novelty. And Alf Pickering sold his store at Novelty, and they bought some property up in Chesaw, up in eastern Washington. And so they're getting ready to leave for their new home. So they let all the kids out of school to come down to the railroad to see them leave. All their furnishings and stuff are in this boxcar. And these are all local valley residents. And you can see they've got lard pails, which they used for lunch pails back in those days. And this is the Lutheran Church at Novelty and then a little bit of the store. But the main reason I put this one in is it's a great picture of a Great Northern crossbuck. That was their style of railroad crossing signs, which looks to me more like a Milwaukee Road's yard limit sign. And here's the Novelty Spur right here. This is that pasture shelter that we just saw that Pickering's at. This is the Novelty Road here. So the roundabout today would be right in here. And then, of course, the Milwaukee line. Well, once the Great Northern line was abandoned, the Milwaukee put a connection in over here, and they tied it into a piece of the Great Northern's main line. And then the rest of this was all picked up and abandoned. And in later years, you could see the grade for this coming down to the highway. But when they put the roundabout in, on the last day that they were working on the roundabout, they were doing some landscaping, and they came down here and bulldozed this whole grade out of there. So that's gone now. And then this is Stillwater. That was a busy places where, like I say, the three railroads all came together here: the Everett and Cherry Valley Traction Company, the Milwaukee Road, and then the Stillwater Logging Company formed a triangle here. The Milwaukee had a little 9 by 10-foot operator's shack here. And then the Great Northern had a 10 by 16 pasture shelter with a 90-foot cinder platform. And then there was a telephone booth here because Cherry Valley Logging Company started interchanging logs to the Milwaukee Road instead of going down here to their log dump and dumping them in the river. They decided to start shipping them by rail. So Milwaukee Road put in this 2,009-foot siding here and built a connection here. And they used this old river track for the empty cars. So they put a special train on here called the Stillwater Logger that would come in, cut his caboose off here, and then pull the whole train by and then line the switch and shove all the empty cars into this track here. Then come back, get the caboose, put it on the rear of the loaded log cars, and then run around and hook on the other end and take them to Riverview, which was about 2 miles below Snohomish, where they had a huge log dump on the river. You can see a connection from Cherry Valley to the Great Northern. This again was another connection for the Milwaukee Road to get materials to build their line. And so the Great Northern would interchange that stuff to Cherry Valley's line here. And then Milwaukee built a connection here that they could come in and get that stuff and take it out on their line. So these two connections were pretty much for construction purposes during the building of the line. Now, later, these trestles here on the Stillwater logging line started to get in bad shape. So the Milwaukee built a connection here, a new connection in 1914 to get the logs in. So Cherry Valley Logging Company had running rights on the Milwaukee from this point clear down to the other end of the siding here to be able to interchange. So that's why there was a phone here so they could talk to the dispatcher. And this is just something I cobbled together from a Google Earth view, but this is the Great Northern line here. There's their Daymeyer's farm. And then they came down here and crossed over. And Highway 203 turns off here and goes over onto the logging line and uses that grade. And then here's the logging line coming down to their log dump. And then the Milwaukee with their siding in here. Stewart was a spur for Carnation Farms, and Carnation Farms had their own private bridge across the river here to get over to get their stuff. And then this is coming into Tolt, and there is a lake here called Horseshoe Lake that the Great Northern had to cross twice on the pile trestle. This is a really poor picture, but it's the only picture I've ever seen of the turntable at Tolt. And then there's the Tolt Depot and the Tolt water tank. And this is kind of a panoramic view, but here's the McDonald, or no, this is the Fisherbird Lumber Company's mill. And the Great Northern served that on a big long spur. And then here's the Great Northern's water tank and the Great Northern Depot and the town of Tolt behind it. And just out of frame would be the turntable and the one stall engine house that was there. This is a map I drew several years ago, but here's the Milwaukee came out on this side of town, the Great Northern on this side. And when the Great Northern line was abandoned, they still had business here, this Fisher-Bird lumber mill that we just saw. And then McDonald shingle mill was built in here too. And so the GN had these big spurs here. And then the Grange store was a customer. And then there was a Standard Oil plant here. So the Milwaukee Road built this connection called the Grange Spur to get over to the GN facilities so that they could still serve those customers. And there's your turntable and the one stall engine house, and they had a coal track there and a small two-track yard. And it's a Google Earth view, but these red dots represent progress ran down would have sat. And here's the Tolt Depot with the engine 304 in front of it and the water tank there. And another view of the Tolt Depot. And then here's one from the other side with the water tank. And then this was the pump house. They had an 8 horsepower gas engine in here to pump the water up into the tank. And the back of the depot. And then if this train wasn't sitting here, we would have a view of the engine house. But we're never going to get one, I guess. This is after the big snow of 1916. In February 1916, Great Northern was the first railroad to get a train through with all this snow. And so this is their first train coming through Duvall. And the guy who took this picture, I got this picture from him, and he said that he got snow all over him when this train went by. But there's the Milwaukee Depot there, and the Great Northern Depot would be just across from the rear of that train somewhere. And this is taken from what they call the old high iron bridge in Duvall. Here's the back of the Milwaukee Depot here. Here's the Milwaukee agent's house on the river. But we can see the Great Northern is gone here. No tracks in there anymore. So this is after 1918 when the rails were picked up. This is the iron bridge again. This king post here is where the Great Northern would have went underneath. And we got the Milwaukee Depot here and the Milwaukee Agent's House, Coal and Oil House. And what happened was after the Great Northern's line got picked up, a logging line came down to the Milwaukee and they put in this interchange, one track for loads, one for empties. And this was called Lazarus Logging Company. And he had a connection to the Milwaukee here and interchanged logs. So here's the bridge that we just saw. And then here's the Milwaukee Depot and the Milwaukee Agent's House. And then the old location of the Great Northern Depot. And then here's another view of the bridge. You can see a stairway on the bridge that was put in at the request of the Milwaukee agent when they built the bridge because he had to transport mail sacks up to the post office. So he'd rather climb these stairs and do it off the bridge than to go out here and climb the hill up to town. But if we zoom in on this bridge, we see a Shay locomotive sitting down here. And that's Lazarus's Shay. And this is after he went out of business. And that Shay sat down there for years. And my dad had the claim to have the whistle off of that Shay. And he would take a spark plug out of his engine of his car, screw the whistle in there, and then run up and down the river road with the whistle screaming. And my grandpa, his dad, got so sick of hearing that whistle, he took it away from him and threw it down in the walls of their barn to get rid of it. Okay, the only um, part of the Great Northern that's still relatively intact is down behind the Stillwater store. There's grades down there in the cornfields that go all the way to Carnation that are still pretty intact. This is the site of a one span uh, pile trestle at one time that's gone. And this is down behind the Stillwater store area. And this is a Great Northern's grade out in the Stillwater cornfields. And then this is the remains of their trestle across Harris Creek. And this is a group photo taken at Tolt in August of 1915. And this is Frank Little, who was the engineer, George Irwin, that was the fireman, and then Roy Boozer and A.E. Hutchinson were the two brakemen, and then Fred Million was the conductor, and then A.B. Wise was the depot agent. And the engine 298 was kind of a historic engine. It pulled the first Great Northern train out of Seattle in 1892. It was a Class E4 460 10-wheeler, and it was built by Schenectady in April of 1889 as Fairhaven and Southern Railway Number 1. And it was renumbered to Seattle and Montana 298 in 1898, and then to Great Northern 298 in 1907. And it was scrapped in June 1923. There was a sister 299 that was the ex-Fairhaven and Southern number 2, and that engine was sold to the Waterville Railway in 1911. And here's the 298 at Delta Yard in Everett awaiting scrapping. And this is the only other engine I know of on the line, the 450. So the 304 we saw a few frames back, that was another Class D, or that was a Class D2 260 mogul, and it was built by Rogers in July 1887 as St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba number 304, and it was scrapped in September of 1923. And then this engine here, the 460, was a Class D5 260 mogul, and it was built by Brooks in September of 1896 as number 381. It was renumbered in 1899 to 460, and it was sold to the Midland and Manitoba Railroad and became their number 3 in 1926. But here it is on the Cherry Valley Local at Monroe. And I apologize for such a poor picture, but it's the only one I could find. Now, the good news is that the Tolt depot still survives, or at least part of it, the ticket office portion and the waiting room. In 1918, they no longer needed the depot there in Carnation because the line had been abandoned. And the depot in Valley, Washington, which is north of Spokane, near Chewelah, had burned down. And so they needed a replacement depot. So they shipped this depot over there. And this portion of it got saved. And so it's still a part of the GN. Here's a comparison picture showing the depot at Tolt and what it looks like today there. Now, as for the crew on the train, I wanted to mention that engineer Frank Little, he passed away on May 17th, 1955 in an Everett hospital after he suffered a stroke while motoring near Marysville. Fireman George Irwin was killed in the December 11th, 1921 wreck of the fast mail train 27 at the Miller River Bridge below Skykomish. And then Brakeman Roy Boozer, he became a conductor, and he was involved in December 28th, 1937 wreck of train 27 at Fern Bluff, which was between Monroe and Sultan. And the engine went down into the Sky River, and fireman E.L. Tucker was swept away and drowned. And here's a page out of the Great Northern Employee Timetable showing the various stations on the line and then your industry spurs. And that's my program.
Ellen, thank you very much. Now, I have to tell you, Robert, I didn't know much about this line
No,
until today.
I never heard about it before. I've driven that route before thinking it was just the Milwaukee that was there. I had no idea GN had a line down there too.
Yeah, this is great, Alan. So let's wrap up our presentation, and then can you can unshare your screen. Um,
I had a couple questions for Alan.
yeah,
Looking for
go
the
ahead, Robert. Go ahead. Yeah, we've got a few minutes.
So, did it end up being a situation where they lost so much money, or they just kind of cut their losses, or they never really materialized after they had really
Well,
identified
it
what
was
they
it
wanted to
was a
build?
pretty light traffic line. Like I said, the Milwaukee cut them out of a lot of their business. And so what I think really what happened is that the USRA came into existence about that time, and they were great on trying to consolidate things. So I think they just said, why don't you just run over the Milwaukee line? So I forgot to mention in my program that when they abandoned their line, the next day they started running over the Milwaukee between Carnation and Monroe. And that lasted for about a year and a half or so. Then they got the idea, let's just interchange our cars to the Milwaukee at Monroe, and they can spot them at the industries. And so the Great Northern still had presence in the valley clear up to 1948 through this interchange of stuff. I think the only customer left was the grain store, but by that point, they blended their own feeds, so they would get occasional carloads of like beet pulp or some kind of grain in there, and that was about the end of the Great Northern business.
So, can you tell me the Milwaukee line that went north to Monroe? Where did that enter Monroe at? Yeah, I remember seeing an old trestle just outside of the east switch at Monroe, but was that the original GN that we're talking about?
Yeah, um, the Milwaukee came in originally on an overhead bridge over the top of the Great Northern and then swung around about where Highway 2 is today, and then came in on down to Lewis Street and had their depot and yards in there.
Is
And
there
then
any,
they very pretty much paralleled the Great Northern going out to Snohomish, and then from there they split off on the other side of the river and went into Everett that way.
is there anything left of the Milwaukee or anything left being
Yeah,
terminated in Monroe?
if you go east of Monroe and look over there on the Burlington Northern Railroad, you'll see a bunch of cottonwood trees and alders growing along there. Well, they're all growing on the old Milwaukee grade out there.
Okay.
And I hiked that grade about, I don't know, 20 years ago, and there were still two or three Milwaukee wooden trestles in deteriorating shape, but they were still sticking up out of the swamps there. But that Milwaukee line was abandoned between Monroe and Lowell in 1936. The Depression had gotten the Milwaukee to the point where they had such a small train that it just wasn't worth uh, the cost of maintaining the line and all that stuff. So they traded running rights to the Great Northern for something else and got rights to run on that.
Excellent. I mean, I had no clue that that line was even there. When he said Cherry Valley, I was thinking somewhere in a different state. So
Oh,
definitely interesting.
yeah, I
Isn't
didn't
that,
realize either. And
didn't
I
you grow
asked
up in
my,
that neighborhood?
huh?
Isn't that where you're originally from?
Yeah, I grew up in Duvall. And I was asking my grandmother one day, I said, "Do you remember the Milwaukee Road Depot being open?" And she says, "Yeah." She says, I remember when Duvall had two depots. She said the Great Northern had a depot in town too. And that's when the light went on. I go, that sign on the end of that building is the Great Northern Duvall sign. And so I went down there and like I say, that weekend they came in and burned that building down and then bulldozed it out to make room for putting a boat launch in down there.
Hmm.
That's how you did it back in the day.
Yeah.
More questions? Look, you just muted.
Me?
No,
Sorry, no, I'm
Robert
sorry
did.
about that. No,
Oh.
I'm good with questions. That's quite a bit of information. I'm going to start looking at my DeLorme maps now after the presentation.
Yeah, Alan, this was great. And, the plan will be that we're going to put this online later this afternoon. And today is October 7th, 2025. And we've had the pleasure, Robert Scott and I, Jonathan Fisher, have had the pleasure of spending some time with Alan Miller. And Alan Miller has informed us about a Great Northern branch, frankly, we knew nothing about. So, on that happy note, thank you for tuning in to today's program. This will be on YouTube later today. And I look forward to seeing you back in the future with our next program. So, at this point, I'm going to end the recording and say to our audience, bye for now.